Hello everyone. This video will draw our attention to a new, or rather a breakdown of the previous chapter in which we focus on teaching and learning comprehension. Last week we explored the concept of teaching language skills, including receptive and productive skills. We emphasized the importance of integrating the four main skills because teaching one skill naturally involves the others. So focusing on just one isn't ideal. We also discussed the role of input and output in teaching language skills and examined two teaching approaches, which are top-down and bottom-up approach. Finally, we reviewed the basic methodological models for teaching both receptive and productive skills. They have the same methodological model because these skills may seem different, but they generally follow a very similar teaching sequence. In this chapter, we focus on teaching and learning comprehension, which covers the two receptive skills, listening and reading. So in this video, we'll explore the key principles of teaching and learning language comprehension, as shown on the slide. We'll also break down the essential points that teachers need to know, with examples and detailed explanations in a separate video, to make this video a little bit shorter and not too overwhelming with information. You may be wondering why we put listening and reading skill together in one chapter instead of separating the two into two chapters. The reason is that the teaching and learning of reading and listening have the same basic methodological techniques, which, if you remember, we looked at in the previous chapter. It follows a somewhat similar pattern, as you can see in the picture here. And since they are both receptive skills which work on students' comprehension and understanding, it is not ideal to separate these two skills into two separate chapters. Now that we have been introduced to this chapter, let's dive into the key principles of teaching receptive skills. When we talk about principles, they are about you as teachers and the belief that you have that certain methods or approaches can best support your students' learning. So let's take a look at the first key principle of teaching and learning comprehension, which is known as effective comprehension work makes your students think. Sounds familiar? Well, if you remember, there are two ways to make grammar teaching meaningful. Challenge your students to think and personalize the grammar. In the same way, teaching receptive skills can be meaningful when we use techniques that get students to think about the input they receive and the output they give. It's also helpful to personalize this to their prior knowledge or background in order to make listening and reading texts a lot easier for them to understand. And when students are encouraged to think, they can concentrate better, they learn more, and they enjoy the process more. That is because thinking involves following clues, processing information, and solving problems, etc. This is especially important as well in the lead-in stage for reading and listening activities. For example, before reading a text, you might show students some pictures related to the topic, and then you ask them to predict what the text will be about. Or for a listening task, you could play a short sound or show a few keywords and ask students to guess the context. So these kinds of activities prepare students to think actively about what they're about to read or hear, which helps them process the information more effectively when they move to the next stage. The second key principle is about what makes a good comprehension technique. So a good comprehension technique gives students a reason for reading or listening. When students know exactly what they're looking for, their attention is more focused. That's why good comprehension techniques always include a clear guide, like questions to answer or a grid to fill in. For example, before a listening task, you might give students a chart with headings like location or notes, and then you ask them to complete it while listening. Or for reading, you could ask students to read and find specific details, such as the main idea of each paragraph. Another activity could be providing true or false statements for students to verify as they read or listen. For instance, before listening to a conversation, you could ask them to tick off which items are mentioned in the dialogue. Or for a reading task, you might create a timeline of events and ask students to fill in as they read. So it's important to share these instructions before they start reading or listening. If you just say, "Hey everybody, read this passage. Now stop reading, close your books and answer the questions." So it becomes a memory test now. It's no longer a comprehension activity anymore. So therefore, the techniques that you choose need to have clear guidance that can ensure students are focused on understanding, not just recalling memories. The third key principle is that students should use a wide range of comprehension texts. Interesting topics motivate students, so choosing texts that relate to their own knowledge and experiences can speed up learning. For example, a reading text about their favorite sport or a listening task on a topic that they have learned about before will engage them more than topics that are unknown to them. So students also need lots of comprehension practice. Therefore, teachers should use a variety of texts. These can include things like, short stories, news articles, interviews, and even poems. With the right techniques, almost any texts can be used for comprehension practice. Some examples include matching, where you ask students to match headings to paragraphs or pictures to descriptions. Summarizing, you have students summarize what they read or heard in their own words. Okay, true, false, or yes, no questions. These can help check understanding of key details. Fill in the blank, provide a gap fill exercise where students complete sentences or a short passage. Ranking or ordering. You ask students to rank ideas or events in the text based on a particular order. Could be time, it could be importance. So using varied texts and techniques can keep students engaged, and it gives them more opportunities to practice comprehension or understanding in many, many, many ways. Okay, so the texts can be from, different styles, which allow them to have more practices, comprehension practices that are also different because of the style of texts. Prediction should play an important role in comprehension work. It's a key real-life skill because we often predict in daily life, especially in conversations. When listening to a conversation, for example, we predict what might happen next based on the context, the tone, or even the words that we've already heard before. So prediction works best in the lead-in stage for both reading and listening activities. Before a reading text, you might show students the title, the pictures around the text, or any related words under the topic, and then you ask them what they think the story will be about. For a listening activity, you could show a picture or keywords that ask them to predict what the speakers might discuss. For example, if the conversation is about planning a trip, showing images of a plane or a map can help students predict what the topic might just be about based on the input that you give to them. So techniques like these encourage students to activate their prior knowledge and engage with the text more deeply, which makes the comprehension process more interactive and enjoyable. The last key principle that teachers should know when it comes to teaching receptive skills is that texts used for listening practice should usually be easier than those used for reading practice. That is because listening is often a lot more difficult than reading, because listeners don't really have control over the text. And when they start listening, they can't pause or go back or reread. So spoken English tends to be faster, and listeners have to process the information in real time. In contrast with reading, students can take their time, right? They can reread difficult parts, they can look up difficult vocabulary that they don't understand. For example, in a listening activity, you might use shorter sentences or simpler vocabulary because students can't revisit the audio. A reading text, on the other hand, might be more complex since students can pause, think, and return to challenging sections. So this difference helps explain why listening practice generally requires easier or more straightforward texts, unlike reading texts.